Regen PowerTech presents Climate Business.
On to our spotlight for this evening. Oxfam has recently come out with a report that has found that it is the world's richest who are responsible for the worsening climate change. But worryingly, it said that while the poorest are the least responsible, they, however, remain the most vulnerable. Let me outline some of the striking figures from that report. Poorest half of the global population are responsible for just 10% of the carbon emissions, whereas the richest have contributed 50% of those emissions. In fact, the higher you go up the income ladder, the starker the carbon inequality becomes. The richest 1% in the world emit, hold your breath, 175 times more carbon than the poorest 1%. In fact, even India's richest lifestyle consumption emissions in G20 is a fraction of what it is in the United States and less than half of that of the richest in China. Has this report vindicated India's position? I'm now joined by Nisha Agarwal, CEO of Oxfam India, who's standing by me in the studio. Thank you very much for joining us on this special. Tell us a little bit about this, Nisha, because I think the underlying message of this carbon inequality report is the economic logic, that the more affluent and more well-off you are, it's natural that the more carbon emissions that you'll be emitting owing to the higher sort of lifestyle that you lead.
So, you know, for us, obviously this report comes at a very important time. We have the negotiations going on in Paris. We feel that the world is at a tipping point. We are all consuming resources at a level that is not sustainable.
Right.
So far, the dialogue has been stuck really at a dialogue between rich countries and poor countries, and who is to blame for the past, and therefore who should take the burden for the future. Now, we have been very concerned about rising income inequality. Right. So last year at Davos, we launched a report that said, you know, today now, in this year, the top 1% of the world's population are now have as much wealth as the remaining 99%, right? And now we say that the two most pressing problems are this very rising, sharp inequality in income and wealth, and the other one is this climate change, this very rapid global warming. So now we are trying to look at these two problems together and saying, is there a link?
Right.
And this report is now saying there is a very strong link, that it's really the rich who are consuming at a level that is totally unsustainable for today.
Right.
And the bottom half are the most vulnerable. They will pay the price, and they're not.
We will come to the specifics about the inequalities within the countries, but let's just talk for a second about the inequality between the countries. And the report and the numbers that you've quoted in your report are rather striking. India is among the least carbon emitters when you compare it to the G20 countries.
Yes.
In that sense, has this report vindicated India's position? Can Indian negotiators actually go and sort of throw this report on the table tomorrow and say, you know, this is what we've been saying, and therefore there has to be an historical overview of carbon emission. It cannot be seen only in terms of the future.
So I would say India's position itself has changed. There was a historical position, which is what you just said. We didn't cause the problem. Yeah. You caused it to the West, and therefore you clean up. And we have to grow. Now we are realizing, you know, we are all on this planet together, that position is no longer valid for a country that overall at least is the third largest emitter.
Right.
So we have taken a huge step forward this time to say we will also do our best. And I think our submission to Paris is not bad. We are making a commitment to really switch to renewables in a very massive way.
Right.
So our position has taken a very big shift internationally. Right. We are kind of saying, yes, we are willing to do our bit. The only problem is when we add up everybody's little bit, it's not adding up. And so when we say the most vulnerable countries on the planet need temperature rise to be limited to 1.5 degrees, or at best 2 degrees, we are already, it seems, from adding up everything.
But how feasible is that, Nisha? Let me ask you. You've said that the eventual accord should sort of set the maximum temperature increase to about 1.5. But whatever we've read so far, it says that even if the countries meet the commitments that they have laid out in INDC, then the average temperatures will go up by 2.7 degrees Celsius.
That's
so
right.
how feasible, how practical is it that to actually cap the overall temperatures to 1.5 as you've proposed in your report?
I think it's very feasible. These are just the very first negotiating stance. Every country is starting from the least. They're waiting to see what others are going to offer, because we all need to do this together. Even if we were to take a huge step, or any country was to take a huge step, it wouldn't make a difference. We all need to do this, right? So this is a big admitted thing that developing countries are also saying. common but differentiated.
Right.
We don't all need to make the same effort, but we all need to make an effort. So that's a big difference.
Right.
So we are now starting with this. It's adding up to 2.7. We have the world's leaders, we have the world's population looking at Paris, saying, we are trusting you to save this planet. So negotiate, you know, give a little more, take a little more.
Right.
And certainly for the West, we don't think they have put anything on the table that is really goes far enough.
What's the level of carbon inequality that you found within India then? Now let's just sort of break it down and go into more macro sort of, data. Is there something that is sort of striking that you've seen, the sort of carbon inequality that you're witnessing within the country?
So the very number that you used, which is to say that the top, in the whole world, the top 10% account for 50% of carbon.
The same can be used for India.
Exactly the same numbers apply in India. You know, Amartya Sen says that we have two Indias today. One is California and one is Sub-Saharan Africa. That also applies to energy. So we have 300 million people who are living without electricity. But the top 10%, you really wouldn't know whether they were living in India or anywhere else in the world.
So there is a
right?
pressing need then to sort of influence the lifestyle choices that the people make, because the report very clearly says that the lifestyle choices of the richest are eventually determined by the decisions of the government. So in that context, public policies will have to sort of address this carbon inequality that you're talking about.
Yes, we say that individuals should of course do whatever they can, but that will not be enough. You know, we are living in a country that is one of the most vulnerable to climate change. 700 million people still derive their livelihoods from agriculture, and most of it is rain-fed. And so when Oxfam works in the poorest states of India. We work in UP and Uttarakhand, Bihar, Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Assam, Orissa. Before Copenhagen, we had organized these large hearings. And, you know, our farmers are mostly women, which is also something not recognized, so that the impact of climate change will be most disastrous for women. So when we would gather all these women, thousands of them, you know, they would all talk about climate change. We think as if we can't make a link between something so global and something so local, but they would all talk about rain now. You know, the pattern is not very clear to them. Sometimes it comes too early, sometimes it comes too late. The crop gets destroyed. The heat we can see is going, you know, this year was the hottest on the planet. So clearly there's a climate change is happening. It's very dramatically affecting the lives of these poor people and largely farmers and largely women in India. And so, even if the rich do something about lifestyle change, that is not enough. The governments need to do more, you know. Firstly, on adaptation. Addressing the issue of what is it that our farmers need to grow, you know, climate resilient agriculture. Secondly, public transportation. You know, we are sitting here in Delhi, the most polluted city in the whole world.
Right, because this report also throws up that it's not just inequality between different economic classes, but also there is a gender sort of a component, not just gender, but even racially we see like that it seems to be the blacks who are perhaps most vulnerable to the climate change. So what would be Oxfam's proposals as far as India is concerned with respect to sort of bridging, at least to a certain extent, this carbon inequality?
So
SUV taxes on SUV, carbon tax on SUVs?
I think it'll require a lot more than that. You know, we need to act. I think when you're saying, you know, does it vindicate India's stance in Paris? Yes, we need a global deal, but so much of what we are suffering from is local. So again, coming back to the pollution issue in Delhi, you're talking about SUVs. We now have the credit of living in the most polluted city, and we know what it's doing to health, and we know what it's doing to premature deaths, and we know what it's doing to all of us, right? And we can take measures. The courts are acting much more in advance than government, saying there is no need for all these trucks to be going through our city, or so many measures that we can take. And people are now quite aware of this, but we still don't see any action coming out of it at all.
The implementation continues to be a bit of a problem.
Public transport. Public transport should be free, and private cars should be taxed as heavily as possible to discourage their use, but you can only do that when you provide good public transport, right?
Precisely.
So this is all matter of public policy, what all needs to be done.
An important element that also came out, which I would want you to sort of elaborate a little bit about, is the fact that you found in your report that India's richest are not as much to blame as the richest in the OECD countries. Why is that so? Because one would imagine that no matter which country and no matter where you are, and if you are rich and if you're among the top 10%, there will be a certain parity in terms of the standards of living whether you're in India or in some other country. Can you explain a little bit why this sort of disparity between the richest in India in terms of the carbon emissions and the richest in the OECD countries like the US?
So many things would be in common between our rich and the
Yes.
Western rich,
Yes.
right? The luxury cars and the travel and all of that. But energy use, you know, there is a north-south divide. So in the north, because of the climate, you use a lot more energy per capita, and we don't really need that so much.
Right.
So I think there are things like that that make it quite different, where even our richest are not consuming as much energy as their rich, or even as their average.
Right.
And certainly our poor are consuming much, much less or have no access at all.
Right. We need to wrap this up. I want to ask you one last question. The report also talks about how there is a congruence in interests now between the rich, because the rich are also now getting affected.
Yes.
Are you therefore implying that, I mean, the fact that there is this urgency that we are seeing as far as this climate change debate is concerned is because the interests of the rich are now getting impacted? Because you've cited some examples, okay, where many properties have been destroyed owing to the sort of hazards that have been brought upon by the climate change. Is that what essentially you're saying?
I think there is an awareness now that we are all living on the same planet. The rich don't have another planet to migrate to, right? And you're seeing this, say, for example, in Chennai. Now, we are sitting here, we've had the worst rains in 100 years. And when you see images of a city, you realize nobody is immune. I mean, the offices that are underwater, or the cars that are underwater, it's the rich suffering for the first time. And you can make that link, I think, not very explicitly from each rainfall to climate change, but broadly the fact that it's now so many rainfalls of this nature that are coming one after another, or cloudbursts, or the frequency of disasters.
Right.
And this sinking feeling that we are all in this together, really.
Right.
And people talk about climate change and link it immediately to disasters, and nobody is immune from that. So I think
Right. There's
finally
far
some
more-
sense of a shared planet. You
There's
know?
far more awareness. And in fact, remember, just in about 2 days' time, the final blueprint for that, for the Paris Accord will be decided, on which there will be a ministerial conference, and that's where the hectic negotiations will take place. Thank you so very much, Nisha Agarwal, for joining us. And this is something, it's an important report and sort of brings
Retail
out the carbon
Power Check
inequality
presents Climate
within
Business.
countries and between countries.